My name's Kieran Finlayson. I'm a senior editor here at Triple Canopy. I'm just going to introduce some of the terms for the next panel. The whole world is passed through the filter of the culture industry, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer wrote from exile in Los Angeles in 1944. The culture industry is one of the most widely adopted terms associated with their organization, the Institute for Social Research. Their analysis of this industry has made an immense contribution to the study of culture in capitalist society, but has had innumerable detractors over the decades. The term's status today is an open question. That the concept would be misunderstood is a hazard of the manner in which it was introduced. It first appeared as the title of a chapter in The Dialectic of Enlightenment, a book of philosophy studying how the domination of nature becomes the domination of man, culminating in Hitler, Stalin, and the atom bomb. It's a volume composed of fragmentary, aphoristic sentences that often conflict with one another. Adorno and Horkheimer never offered a tidy definition of the phrase, whose meaning can hardly be summarized without reference to the sum of its complex and contradictory, they would say dialectical, uses across the essay. I won't attempt to summarize it here, but I will add that the term was deliberately chosen to avoid any interpretation that could be embraced by the culture industry's advocates. The culture industry is an industry, a singular one with many branches encompassing film, television, radio, magazines, book publishing, and more. It is not simply a vehicle for expression arising spontaneously from the masses, or merely the contemporary form of popular culture. Its unclear object is not mass culture alone, but the force creating and capturing all cultural markets, commodifying spheres of high and low art. Among the many questions the essay endeavors to answer are, how do the techniques of the culture industry work? How do authoritarian tendencies within popular culture appear as expressions of freedom? How is the logic of commodification entered into the work of art itself? What real social needs does it fill? Why, after generations living in the world made by this industry, whose products are attached to the most cherished and intimate moments of our lives, do we, its consumers, ultimately regard it with suspicion and feel betrayed by its promise of happiness? 80 years have now passed since the initial version of Dialectic of Enlightenment was published. We might ask once again, what is the place of culture in the administered world? Revolutions in finance, telecommunications, and computing have transformed the means of cultural production. Cinemas and radio have given way to platforms. Trends toward cultural homogeneity has ostensibly been overtaken by new technology for individual targeting, opening innumerable micro-markets. In the intervening years, the object of Adorno and Horkheimer's critique seems only to have grown in size, power, and appeal. On this panel, 4 culture workers and writers will appraise the culture industry and its critics today. Each will give a short presentation, then we'll have a panel discussion, and followed by questions from the audience. Joey DeFrancesco is a musician and organizer who performs with the band Downtown Boys and La Neve. He's a founder of the United Musicians and Allied Workers, UMAW. A.S. Hamrah is the author of The Earth Dies Streaming, Film Writing 2002 to 2018, and a contributor to publications including N+1, Harper's, Book Forum, The Nation, and the New York Review of Books. He's worked as a movie theater projectionist, a semiotic brand analyst, a political pollster, a football cinematographer, a zine writer, and for the film director Raul Ruiz. Blair McClendon is an editor, filmmaker, and writer. His work has screened at Sundance, Cannes, Tribeca, TIFF, and other festivals around the world, and his writing has been published in N+1, The New Republic, The New Yorker, and elsewhere. And Lydia Goehr is the Fred and Fannie Mack Professor of Humanities in the Department of Philosophy at Columbia. She's the author of books including The Quest for Voice, Music, Politics, and the Limits of Philosophy, Elective Affinities, musical essays on the history of aesthetic theory, and most recently, Red Sea, Red Square, Red Thread, a philosophical detective story. Please welcome them. So Blair here will give the first presentation.
Sit in chat.
Whichever you'd like.
I'm just going to sit and chat. I wanted to start, I guess, from a line that's in the culture industry, that is, the industry bows to the vote it has itself already rigged. If anybody here has ever worked in making a film, particularly in post-production, they know there is this incredible fiction called the audience that you can summon whenever you want something to be the way you want it to be. You just have to say things like, I don't get it, or I get it rather, but the audience doesn't. Or you say things like, I don't think the audience really wants this to feel so political. And it's really helpful because the audience is never in the room with us. So you just have to believe them, and often they're like, well, I've seen many audiences, so I would know. My general response when I'm feeling ornery is that the audience is not dumber than anybody in the room. They're probably smarter than us, certainly based on the fact that we're in that room spending a lot of time arguing about a picture, and they are just going to look at the picture. But the reason I thought it was interesting, and perhaps a place to jump off, is because it is also a bit about, in the context of the actual essay, a bit about how the industry often winds up reproducing what it says the audience wants, and it really has no other choice. It's just those are the desires that are out there, and it has to do it. We would love to make good films. The audience doesn't want good films. We can't do it. And there's never really a pause about who formed the audience that does not want good films. Recently, as maybe some of you know, I worked on a film called Union that chronicled the rise and struggles of the Amazon labor union. It started filming more or less when they first were like, what if we started a union? And went for several years after that, and this year has finally been released. We ran into some issues that I can speak about because now it's public and are part of the release campaign, which is that many people said, your film went to Sundance, it's a labor documentary, it's a verite film, it won an award, we cannot distribute it because we have various contacts, or might have various contacts with Amazon in the future. Which was a strange position to be in, though I will say I kind of thought that might happen. And so the film has been released through a self-release distribution pattern. It's still in New York, you should see it. But this has led to a lot of discussion sort of about the role of Amazon, and more importantly perhaps about monopoly, which I've always thought Amazon is a funny example of in the film industry, because by everyone's understanding of Amazon, it is this massive entity, certainly monopolistic, at least in its desires. And in the film industry, it's actually not that good at its job. It's, like many other companies, gotten really into this idea that streaming is the future, and we were talking a little bit about it backstage, and he gave me this incredible phrase, which I hope I'm not scooping anything you're about to talk about, of mimetic isomorphism from when he was doing sociology of business, about how once one thing is successful in business, then the next person tries to do it. And it does not actually matter after a few iterations that it's not really that successful anymore. Everybody just keeps doing it. And that's sort of been true for streaming. Netflix recently became profitable. It's not a profitable model, which you can figure out very quickly by saying to yourself, if I give somebody $16 and can see every movie they've made, will those numbers add up? The answer is no. And everybody has sort of known it from the beginning that it wouldn't work. But what it has pretty successfully done is introduce this question of platforms and of these sort of contained environments in theory, wherein you are seeing these sort of top-down ideas that are more or less constructed. I think Apple is a bit more top-down sometimes, Amazon a little less so, Netflix is vast. But what it's led to I think, is this strange situation where people are constantly decrying what is a perceived, and sometimes true, lowering of artistic value in general filmmaking, and that this is due to the streamers. Who the streamers themselves will say it's the audience, actually. They just really like this stuff. And as is often said, and I was talking about backstage, what's really true when you break down any of the numbers is mostly when people are streaming, they're watching Friends. Everything else kind of pales in comparison to that, which has always seemed to me to be an incredible opportunity, because it doesn't really matter anyway. They're watching Friends. So you might as well do whatever you want over here, because they're gonna watch Friends. That's not how it's broken down. If anything, I think sort of the pressure has intensified that these things should be codified, that there should be sort of a more standardized, which is a pretty incredible thing to say about Hollywood, but a more standardized way to produce films, or as they like to say, content, that really is sort of to the best of their knowledge, reacting, I think they would say, to audience desires, but shaping them, which has led to this real fetish for data that all the streamers have, which they love to tell you. They know exactly when people get bored. They know exactly when something needs to blow up. They know exactly when you should cancel a show, which is 2 seasons, because then the rate goes up. But it is always sort of talked about, at least internally, as a purely reactionary, and I don't mean that in the reactionary way, but reactive question, which is the audience is out there, and they have all of these desires, and we are just studying them and learning them and then giving them what they want, and we are doing nothing to shape that. Which I've always countered, at least in my mind, a statement that was made early on about Goehr, which is that there was not an audience for Goehr before him. He just made one. And that idea, I think, has kind of disappeared. Largely, I think it is downwind of a question of monopoly, which, when you reread the Adorno text, it's very hard, I think, now for me not to read that and think, you don't know how good you had it, actually. It was going to get really, really bad. But on the other hand, he also didn't see something coming, not just the bad thing now, but that text is written before the rise of really any serious notion of independent cinema. And so reading some of it, I think you get to this section where you're like, well, actually some of this is going to break down a little bit. It's not going to be quite as top-down. Then Capital had its long vengeance, and now it is more top-down than ever. And I think applying that to now, and thinking a bit about this question of the industry bows to the vote it has itself already rigged, I've been thinking a lot the last few weeks about why it even feels the need, in fact, for there to be this vote that they are rigging, particularly once you have achieved monopoly. If you're Netflix and you're the sole profitable streamer, one person could take that as an invitation to say, you've won. You can do whatever you want now. You can try things out. You could imitate the old Hollywood that he hated and have an A picture and a B picture and see what happens. But in fact, we've seen sort of a drive to go further and further into this sort of fetish again of data and of figuring out desires in a backwards way. And what I've sort of thought heading forward from that, and I guess I won't get too far ahead of a question we'll get to later, is where does that wind up leaving us? And I know there's lots of anxieties now around the questions of AI, around the questions of de-skilling of these things. But what I've thought for a while is that actually the thing that AI represents in that term, it started happening a long time ago. I was on a panel recently, also as a representative of cinema, called Why Is Everything So Ugly? And my answer, which I think is much related to this one, was actually quite simple, which is that it was a labor problem. What used to be the work of many departments became the work largely of the VFX department. Tellingly was, for the most part, the one not unionized department, but also is a department that is not trained to do all of these other things. They are not people who are trained to light. They're not people who are trained to do set decoration. They're trained to do VFX. But slowly but surely, you have seen a push from many other departments onto one, which I think really raises a question of what really is the point of what we're doing when we're, in theory, making movies. If what it is, at the best sense, is you are slightly subservient to capital and attempting to get away with something, you've brought in all these artists and artisans and technicians. But if you can find a way to make the image permanently mutable or infinitely mutable, and make the finality of the image delayed as long as possible so that it goes the furthest downstream it can to the very end, you've created, I think, sort of a new paradigm just for how you are conceiving of making a movie, which is, instead of the famous thing of Ford saying you shoot exactly for what you want so they can't edit it, you've actually created sort of a cinema of and for capital, where the image does not exist until whoever signs the checks actually clears it at the very end, rather than whoever's signing the check having to make do with what's been done in the meantime. We can talk a bit more about that later, but to me, when I think sort of where do we head from here and what is the expanded diagnosis from that, I think the real shift is less the politics or predilections of any one filmmaker than just that we've really shifted who actually even is responsible for the image you're seeing.
Up next is Scott.
I'm gonna tell an anecdote about audience research based on something you said, because for a long time I was a semiotic brand analyst in the television industry for television networks, and that's called qualitative research. But I had to observe a lot of quantitative research too in my job. So sometimes I would go to focus groups and sit there and watch that happening and other kinds of things like that. And one thing that was done quite frequently in the television industry is something called dial tests. Do you know what dial tests are? Okay, so dial tests are when they just find regular people to come in and watch a show that hasn't been broadcast yet and turn a dial when they like stuff, turn it up when they like stuff, and turn it down when they don't like stuff. So in doing this research, one thing that they found over many years, starting in the 80s, was that men love helicopter shots. So if a show starts with shots, over the city of the Brooklyn Bridge coming to Manhattan or whatever city it is, it could be Louisville, it doesn't matter. It's just a helicopter shot going out over the Golden Gate Bridge coming into San Francisco. Men always turn the dial up when they see that. And women, sometimes they don't do anything, sometimes they turn it down. So, this became such a cliche of television that every single show starts that way, especially cop shows and, action-oriented shows. And in my experience in television, that was the last time they listened to the audience. That was it, especially in the post-Nielsen era, where television ratings aren't meaningful anymore. They just depend on these numbers that come from streamers that aren't checked by anyone, that are completely, developed internally and are essentially meaningless and are for the stock market. So, in my old job, I had to go to various communities around the country. I would go to places where, the Latino population was growing exponentially, like 300%, and I would be charged with studying these groups and trying to determine what they wanted to see on television. And after I did this for several years, I realized it was a complete waste of time, because they weren't going to listen to any of this stuff that we presented them. They just had a budget for research that they had to spend a certain amount of money every year, and they spent it on things. And towards the end of my tenure in that job, what I really wanted to do was start studying the CEOs. I wanted to embed myself into the homes of the CEOs for like a month at a time and just totally monitor their media diet. Like every moment of the day and night, what are they watching? What are they reading? What is it that they're taking in that's causing them to make the decisions that they make? And I realized, as a writer, I was also a writer when I was doing this job, I realized as a writer that that's called a magazine profile. It's not a form of market research anymore. And so when you're doing that, you really can't do it because it would just become a puff piece. No one would ever allow you to report the actual truth of what's going on in the minute-to-minute, dial test that is their lives, So that leads me to what I was going to talk about originally. I started to write a piece for this called "Accept All Cookies." That was about kind of the immiseration of the experience of seeing films. And so Blair has kind of talked a lot about that, but people don't really accept this as a true thing. Today, people watch movies mostly on their computers or on other kinds of devices at home. And when people stand up for the theatrical experience now, oftentimes there's resistance to that, And yet this is something that Horkheimer and Adorno kind of predicted, that there would be this kind of conformist understanding of experience that had to bury previous iterations of how we receive art, and that's what's going on. And I was thinking about the chapter in the Dialectic of Enlightenment about the culture industry and how it's so prophetic in so many ways, but they can't. In writing in 1944 and a little after, they can't predict this kind of immiseration. Although they imagine this kind of administered world, as they call it, they don't really understand how brutally empty it's going to be. And that it's going to be based on like people staying at home, not going out. You come to live in a place like New York City, you don't expect to be just sitting in your house watching television, And that's most people's experience of art now in some ways, or culture. That's the culture industry. And that's what I was going to cover in Accept All Cookies. And I also wanted to talk about how the media plays into this by spending so much time writing about television. So if you read magazines that are supposed to be, kind of highbrow, upper middle brow, whatever you want to call them, like the New Yorker, or solidly middlebrow things like New York Magazine. Most of the arts coverage is about television now, and so we've become trapped in this world that constantly tells us to watch TV, stay at home, and I don't think this is something that Horkheimer and Adorno really saw happening, and I don't think they saw the media like the New York Times, right? Constantly doing these kind of think pieces about why do we watch Netflix so much? Like there's always this presumption that it's everyone. Every single person is sitting at home watching Netflix, and I'm going to tell you why that's happening. Then it turns out to be some kind of like freakonomics, reason. Like there were zero interest rates, so they were allowed to make a lot of shows, and then we somehow thought they were good, but then they weren't really that good. But some of them are still good. This is like all cultural analysis now in all the major magazines and newspapers that we read. And that seems like something that there's like an inkling of this in the culture industry chapter, but it's not fully grasped that it would become so, insular in this way. And I just wanted to tell a story to end this little introduction. I don't know if anyone saw this in the news recently. There was a flight on Qantas Airlines that was going from Sydney to Japan. And on the flight, the entertainment system wasn't working properly. So the passengers, who are an audience, of course, on an airplane, because the entertainment system wasn't working properly, they were asked to vote on what movie should we all watch together. Because the dysfunction in the system was that everyone had to watch the same thing, which is like being in a movie. So they voted on this, and they decided they watched this movie called Daddy-O, which is a movie with Sean Penn and Dakota Johnson. And I haven't seen it, but it's a movie for adults, there's sex in it, and so on. So they started screening this, and the whole plane was absolutely outraged by this. because there's sex scenes in it and so on, and there's kids on the plane or whatever. The audience completely rebelled against watching Daddy-O. So they had to turn off Daddy-O, and the staff of the plane, the crew of the plane, had to decide now what children's movie would be shown to the entire plane. And that, to me, completely encapsulates the situation that we're all in right now. You know? So then they showed a children's movie, and, you know, presumably everybody was happy, and that was the end of the story.
Joey?
Yeah, hey, I'm Joey. I'm a musician. I'm going to shift from film to music industry now, but I mean, mostly talking about my role as an organizer with an organization I helped found called United Musicians and Allied Workers, or UMAW, or UMAW. I'm probably just going to be calling it. So I wanted to give just a quick overview of a couple things that the organization does to then look at how the Adorno and Horkheimer can relate back or like help us as activists trying to transform this culture industry, like take power back from the monopolies that were being described by the previous two speakers. So we started in 2020, kind of like right as COVID was coming on, like totally shut down the music industry and a lot of the culture industry. And the goal of the organization was to kind of organize the vast masses of freelance musicians in this country and around the world who have not been organized at all, don't have any kind of organization, right? So there are some organizations, unions for like orchestra musicians, for instance, but most musicians, like most cultural workers, you have many, many bosses, so they weren't organized. So we found the organization around then with this goal to like organize musicians to fight back, take power back from the monopolies, make things better for musicians. Just want to go over a couple of the campaigns we've done that I'm going to keep referring back to. So one was taking on the streaming giants that we launched in 2020 as a campaign called Justice at Spotify. It was the first big collective effort of musicians trying to pressure a streaming service to pay artists better overall. So we had, you know, tens of thousands of artists signed on, going to picket lines, Spotify offices all over the world. This has now morphed into some legislation we're pushing called the Living Wage for Musicians Act that we put together largely with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib's office that would transform how streaming royalties are paid out. So this is one of our big points of focus. Another one has been getting musicians more money for like gigs and festivals. The biggest campaign we've done on this is called Fair Pay at South by Southwest. So you might be familiar with the South by Southwest Festival in Austin, Texas. Infamously paid musicians virtually nothing, in many cases literally nothing, for a couple decades of its existence. We similarly got, you know, tens of thousands of musicians on board to protest this, and over the last 2 years have successfully forced this festival to give musicians raises for the first time in the existence of the festival. Connected with that, also, we've been part of getting musicians into Palestine solidarity efforts. A lot of that's looked like kind of more BDS oriented efforts. So with South by Southwest, for instance, the festival was deeply invested in the weapons industry and the US military. The sort of manifestation of this at the festival is almost like an overbearing, too heavy-handed example of what we're discussing today and what is in Dialectic of Enlightenment, where you had music stages at South by Southwest excuse me, that had big signs outside the stage that said Department of Defense X Tech, and they had like tech defense industry panels all day, interspersed with bands playing. And then I remember the first day, the headlining thing at the DoD X Tech stage was someone from Spin Magazine interviewing the 90s boy band Hanson, right, on this stage. So it's like overwhelmingly evil, but also overwhelmingly dull at the same time, right? I think these are two things they're hitting at in this chapter, but we organized musicians and successfully won this year and got the festival to pledge to kick out the defense industry, and they're not working with the defense industry anymore. Thanks. So it's possible to do, and this inspired other efforts like the Bands Against Barclays efforts that got similar efforts in the UK, which are successful at kicking out Barclays Bank as a sponsor. So I just wanted to give that kind of overview, a couple things UMA's done to give context here for why this chapter could be useful for activists and this organizing work, right? The first one is the discussion of monopoly, which has already been hit on to some extent, right? They write about how the sameness and homogeneity in the cultural industry is stemming from the level of monopolization in who controls cultural production, that you have a small number of companies that are guiding this effort, even if they pretend like the audience is guiding, it's a small number of companies doing it. As Blair was saying, in the film industry is also true in the music industry. It almost seems prophetic, but also almost quaint reading Adorno talk about it because of the level of monopolization now in the music industry, where you have 3 major record labels, right? Sony, Universal, Warner Brothers, that control a bigger share of the profits of the industry than ever before, right? In contrary to the predictions of the democratization with the internet, right? They control more than ever before. In live music, right? Live Nation, Ticketmaster monopoly controls more and more venues in our city and across the world. In terms of how we listen to music, the platforms, right? Spotify, YouTube with radio, what used to be Clear Channel, now iHeartRadio, control virtually everything, have a very powerful monopoly on what we see and hear. And this has intensified this trend towards sameness in both aesthetically and ideologically for what we hear in the music industry, so much so that the thing that sticks in my head, there was a UN report on streaming a few years ago that came out that concluded in describing the streaming economy as a cultural human rights violation because of how deeply it was destroying local music cultures around the world, right? So this is a global monopolized system. So there's the monopoly piece that sticks out to me, but the other piece that stuck out to me from the Adorno is relevant to us today is the construction in the culture industry of an idea of naturalness or democracy to justify itself. So when Adorno and Horkheimer are talking about it, it's already been somewhat described. The earlier speakers saying, they pretend like it's this natural, virtuous cycle in which audiences want something, so the culture industry produces it, and so on in this beautiful circle, which of course obscures the power relationship, who owns what gets produced, how it's dictated, and so on. Now, the last 80 years, this has become even more intensified and particularly accelerated with personalized algorithmic listening. The claim to naturalness is even more intense, where it's not even just this virtuous cycle between the producer and the consumer, but now we are told and led to believe that, in fact, we as an individual listening to Spotify are getting fed back to us this perfect, natural reflection of our own desires and our listening habits and just what we want. Again, further obscuring the power relationship, who owns Spotify, what they're fed back. What's coming out in a few weeks, the Spotify Wrap that comes out every year, I feel like is a good reflection of this. Like, everyone shares this, not to say like, oh, here's the list of corporate algorithmic slop that was fed to me this year, but instead, you're saying, like, this is actually a perfect natural reflection of my taste. And this is why I'm unique and special to listen to. And this is not just a kind of annoying thing. I think this has real consequences for our activism because it points people to a really individualistic path, right, and away from collective action. Because if you believe the industry is just natural, this natural perfect market reflecting desires that are natural desires, then if you just shift the market a little bit, it'll just fix itself. So when we launched the Spotify campaign a few years ago, it was like Web3 stuff was big, and people were just like, oh, why are you wasting your time organizing and building power in the industry? Just make NFTs, and if we always make NFTs, the industry will just fix itself, and we don't have to bother with that anymore. Or with the South by Southwest campaign, people are like, oh, why are you even protesting South by Southwest? Just make your own music festival. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? That's cool if you want to make your own DIY festival, but if we as an organization had just put on a DIY punk festival in San Antonio at the same time as they're doing theirs in Austin, it would be cool, but we wouldn't have succeeded in getting the US military kicked out, right? So I think there's real consequences to this mystification and idea of naturalness to deter actual building of collective power in the industry. I think that's something we continue to struggle with and push against in UMA, in my organization.
Thank you. Lydia?
It should just be on.
Is it? Hi, I'm Lydia. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to do something a little different. I come from a philosophy department. I've been reading Adorno for quite a few years. What I wanted to say is I think that the idea of a dialectic or a critique is much harder than we think it is. When Adorno and Horkheimer wrote the Dialectic of Enlightenment, they took on fascism with one hand, Nazi Germany, Stalinism, and so on with one hand, and Hollywood with the other. And you could have said, why those two extreme poles? And one obvious answer was that they were hanging out in Hollywood in exile, a little bit in New York at Columbia, that's another story. And then they went, but they'd been thrown out of Germany, and Nazi Germany, and so they had these two places in mind. But if you read their book very carefully, what you see them telling you is that if there's a perfect construction of surface appearance, if culture is about the production of appearance, the production of surfaces through film, music, opera, etc., then, and it's very smooth and standardized and naturalized, as you've all been using the terms, then the aim of the critique, not criticism, but critique, is to find cracks in the surface for the kind of activism or protest that you want to bring out of it. But they said that protest and activism and cracks rarely appear where you think they appear. For example, Adorno wrote a little essay on white people who go suntanning. And he said this is a really weird thing. They try to get as brown as possible, and then they say they hate the brown person. I mean, how weird is that? They want to change the color of their skin, well, they're out and out racists. Why would he bother to pick that out? Because it never occurs to you when you go to the beach at the summer and you're browning your beautiful bodies that there's a really deep contradiction in the beliefs you have about skin and color. Tiny example. But he also said, for example, that when we look for contradictions or cracks within the surface of things, it's really easy to go to the avant-garde, to the intelligent production, the serious films that we all like, you know, because we're so clever. Because it's easy to see them being critical, having our beautiful critical minds. It used to be easy to go into the university and see people with critical minds. Not quite so easy anymore. But then, but he said, if you go to Hollywood, there's a production of filmmaking, which is now in our home, in our living rooms, and Netflix. Actually, they did talk about everything going into the home via the radio and domestic life. So they really did know about that, even in the 1940s. And they said, the aim of the critique is to look inside Hollywood films for the cracks there. And why did they want us to look inside for the cracks in Hollywood? Because only by cracking things open do you have any possibility of change. That was their basic principle for the dialectic of enlightenment. And one of the most important points they made is that if you want to diagnose fascism, it's really easy to look at Nazi Germany. It's like a sort of test case, right? There's no problem. Look there, look at those horrible little fascists over there, Nazis over there. He said, but look in America, because remember where they wrote this. They couldn't write this in 1944 in America, that they were already being spied on and all FBI files, we know about all that. But they said, if you want to understand fascism and totalitarianism, look for where it doesn't seem to be around and go straight to America, because fascistic tendencies in democracy are much harder to find than they are when they come to the surface, as in Germany. So the dialectic of enlightenment is actually about the potential fascistic tendencies coming to fruition in democracy. And I think in 5 days, God help us, that idea will become one of the most relevant, it already is, one of the most relevant things that we can learn from the problem 80 years ago. We can't write about that now. We're talking about tomorrow. I'm not saying fascism is the same 80 years ago as it is now, but they always described social tendencies. And they said, look where it's least hard to find. Don't do the easy work. Don't look where it's easy to find. So we talk about monopolies and big business and all this kind of thing. But they said, look at the weirdnesses of your behavior when you, in the words you use, in the slogans you use, in the tiniest cracks and corners where you think the problem hasn't infiltrated yet. And then you'll see where the problems really lie. So that's mostly what I wanted to say. I also, in relation to the previous panel, which was totally brilliant, wanted to say that I wrote a book recently, which is the longest thing ever written almost in the history of mankind. No, it's only 600 pages. But it told the history of a joke about a painting that doesn't exist. It happened to be about Jews and Egyptians, so it was more timely than I knew. I wrote it before the present troubles. But I refused in this book, it came out with Oxford University Press, I refused to use quotation marks because I wanted to challenge the idea that material that we put into our books achieves originality simply by being placed into the quotation marks of original authors. So I said every single word in this book is stolen, it's plagiarized, but I've repatterned every single word to make the material mine so that it's my book, but it's made out of my history of reading. And the press was so pissed off with me. They said, oh, God, Lydia, oh, you really have to do this. Well, my very first book I wrote 40 years ago was actually about the development of the work concept, originality, and copyright law. So I was actually trying to undermine the book I'd written and become famous with. I was trying to sort of subvert my own career. And still they didn't get it. That came out with Oxford as well, and they didn't sell that either. So, I've been trying in my own little ways to subvert authorship and copyright and all these things. But the more important point is that Adorno and Horkheimer teach us it's not the big gestures and big slogans that are really activist and really constitute protest, but the small things we do to crack through administrative power. And being at Columbia at the university at the moment, I understand that all too well. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. To build on the point Lydia just made, the title of this panel, Organized Amusement, comes from a quote in the chapter that I'll read that I think will build on it. So it's from a section where Adorno and Horkheimer are using cartoons to reflect on the sadism of contemporary culture. They say that the quantity of organized amusement is converted into the quality of organized cruelty. The jollity dispels the joy supposedly conferred by the sight of an embrace and postpones satisfaction until the day of the pogrom. To the extent that cartoons do more than accustom the senses to the new tempo, they hammer into every brain the old lesson that continuous attrition, the breaking of all individual resistance, is the condition of life in the society. Donald Duck in the cartoons and the unfortunate victim in real life receive their beatings so that the spectator can accustom themselves to theirs. I was wondering, does this sort of argument about the culture industry kind of in and of itself directly contributing to not only reactionary politics, but to political violence. I guess, does this feel like it has purchase today, or in what way?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of like elephant in the room answer to that is just we made a TV star, and then the TV star grew quite powerful. And I think a thing I have often said that I wouldn't say is in defense of him, but is when people are like, well, Trump is actually like not that good, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, he's actually very good at being on TV. And it's a skill that most people don't have. It's very hard to be on television. If you've ever just asked somebody to look into a camera and keep looking, it's very hard for people to do. They immediately look away. Rihanna's also very good at this. She can look directly into a camera. And in that sense, yes, I mean, I think that is a very clear path there, and perhaps the most obvious and vulgar example. But I suppose sort of in line with a bit of what I was saying before too, I think like the step behind that is that when you look at, even regardless of it being Trump or any particular person, what sort of, not only viewer, but what sort of mechanisms that the viewer is using to view this thing is something like reality television actually cultivating. It's not really cultivating like meticulous attention. It's not cultivating like any real understanding of people. And I was thinking about this when you started talking about naturalizing. It's always just sort of been fascinating to me how much it gets talked about in terms of the conflicts they're having with each other, and you know what this person is like and what that person is like. And even though everybody on some level knows, well, it's fake, it still has like sort of entered this discourse of the Real Housewives just are like that, and she does this and she says this, rather than being like, well, we are actually just like trying to cultivate a kind of viewer that A, this is even legible to, and B, that then that is their sort of their form of attention that they bring into the world. Because sort of even a step beyond reality television, just like working in documentary, the like hardest thing you can do with footage that isn't shot like fiction to make sense is just to make it legible in some way that makes any of that experience read like you know what happened in a room. And that's, you know, obviously it had its own troubling practices forever, but whenever I sort of think about like what is the matter with television, I'm often not like, well, the problem is that the stories are boring and the actors are bad. I think it just cultivates a like form of viewing the world that is actually quite bizarre and takes a lot of work to train people to find legible.
It's important to identify NBC Universal as the culprits in bringing Donald Trump to the fore. It is because of The Apprentice, the television show, that he became president. There's no way to argue that. People talk about Trump as the Twitter president. That is not true. He's the television president. That's why he was so obsessed with Nielsen ratings and would talk about them constantly during his first campaign in 2016. I mean, he doesn't really understand Nielsen ratings completely, but that's the world in which he wants to live, and that's what's important to him, is to command television time, and for that television time to get high ratings, which is ironic because ratings don't even matter anymore. But in a sense, it's his election that partially made that true. The passage from the book that Sharon read is interesting because Donald Duck is in it. And what is the phrase right before Donald Duck? Because they kind of are preemptively blaming Disney for something. You know, they're specifically naming a Disney product in that.
Yeah, it's to the extent that cartoons do more than accustom the senses to the new tempo. They hammer into every brain the old lesson that continuous attrition, the breaking of all individual resistance, is the condition of life in the society.
Right, and that is exactly how Disney operates, right? Disney goes around the world finding every possible viewer, especially younger viewers, and then holds them upside down by their ankles and shakes them until money falls out. And they're not happy until they've done that with every single person. You know, and that's the kind of violence that is being described in that passage, I think.
Yeah, for me, there's so many examples of this, but I think a really direct example of how a monopolized culture industry reinforces dominant politics and ideology and violence is right now the case of Palestine. And there are, of course, many artists who are speaking out in the music industry, but at the same time, the most billionaire artists, the most successful ones, are largely not saying anything, right? And this is not a coincidence, and we can of course say they should, sacrifice the money and speak out anyway. Yes, we all know that they should do that, but I think it's also important to look at, how a monopolized culture industry also reinforces them not doing that. That if you have 3 big record labels, if you have a Spotify algorithm that's just dictated by some mysterious engineer somewhere that can punish you on a playlist or not, if you have Live Nation that's controlling all of the big stadium venues and also has an Israeli subsidiary, right? The costs, right, for these billionaires to speak out, for them, right, they interpret it as being enormous. Right, and so they are deterred from speaking out, deterred from taking any position which is contrary to the dominant ideology, to the dominant politics. And in a situation we're in now, with our country actively funding a genocide, I think it's very maybe just more spectacularly obvious how this system is functioning to keep pop stars silent, to keep musicians silent, and to keep them scared of rocking the boat because there's 3 tech CEOs who will cut off their billionaire pop star status if they say the wrong thing. And there have been some pop stars who have spoken out, and some of them have been surprising, right? Like Macklemore, making these songs, and he was punished, right? The day after he said "fuck America," was kicked off of some big international music festival he's playing, right? So I think, again, very clear example there with the case of artists speaking or not speaking about Palestine.
The question you asked us, you put it in terms of a regressive politics. Yeah, in the diagnosis they offered, I'm just repeating what I said before, for them, a regressive politics was coincident with a progressive politics because it was a failure of the progressive Enlightenment. After all, it had led to America and Germany, and America not being in a very good light in the 1940s, even though they won the war. So it was very complicated. But Walt Disney obviously had a suspect background or politics behind him. But they chose the cartoons because of their strategy of writing, which was to note the form of exaggeration. And in the development of cartoons, every behavioral gesture is exaggerated. Every word is exaggerated. They wanted to pick out the exaggerated gestures, as Charlie Chaplin did in the great speech, of arm waving, as in Hitler. There's too big, too grand, people, political leaders screaming instead of talking. The too loud voice, Donald Duck with the mouth that's way too big. And that's why they chose it, not to talk about regressive politics, but to make us pay attention to the exaggerated form of our gestures. And the whole of the dialectic of enlightenment is written through exaggerated propositions. And they said only in exaggeration from Freud does truth come out. And so that's why they picked on those comedies, I think. So we have to look at our behavior when we have, we're over-emphatic or we raise our voices and so on, especially in political speech giving, which is now dominant. You have to scream at rallies and so on. And this is what they were warning us about. What kind of political speech is that when people shriek at the audience what kind of audience hears screaming and feels satisfied by that, feels persuaded by that kind of political messaging. And that was going on everywhere. I mean, Adorno wrote this book on this Martin Luther Thomas radio addresses that were coming in, of this, the analysis of the speech patterns, and said, this is the most terrifying thing that's happening through the radio in America. And so I think that's why the comedies were chosen from Hollywood. I'm sorry, I'm just going back to the history, but
no, that's great. These are wonderful radio lectures about like really early, like right-wing AM radio.
Yeah, right.
Very worth paying attention to. It's one major difference between 44 and today is that all of these industries are they're transnational now. They're globalized now. Things that you're no longer maybe just making a film for an American market. Maybe it also needs to serve different national markets kind of all across the world. So I guess I was wondering if in your own fields, what impacts does this kind of like the global scope of cultural production and kind of industrial demand have, either in terms of doing criticism or making work or doing organizing against a transnational corporation?
Can I go first if we go this way? I just wanted to tell a story. I was working for a UNESCO group from actually when I was in Berlin, and we went to Egypt and various countries, Middle East countries, not Israel with this group, but Middle East countries. And we went to Tunisia, and I very proudly and conceitedly gave a lecture on Adorno and the transmission of radio and blah, blah, blah. And an elderly guy came up to me, and he said to me, you can damn global transmission all you want. You can give all your beautiful Western hypotheses. But without radio, I would have had nothing in my childhood. I came from a place, a village, and having a radio saved my life. It was where I first heard music. I first heard about this. I've heard about that. And he said, you all talk about so much globalization, but it's always in one direction. And that kind of Western hegemony we're used to, we're very familiar in our language, but we still affirm it and perpetuate it in our cultural criticism. Even your question, I'm afraid. So I just wanted to give the other side is that we have to be careful who's doing the talking. The we, doing the analysis.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, I agree. Like the technologies themselves, right, can obviously have benefits and costs to like spreading. I think when I'm thinking about the music industry, it's more, the negative is more like the monopoly, like who's dominating the technology. So, the internet, not inherently evil, but if all the music with the internet is going through Spotify and YouTube and their, algorithms associated with them, the overall effect of this is, I mentioned the UN report earlier, right? Destruction of local music cultures in favor of, US Anglophone pop music. And this is, well documented that this is happening. And again, it's not just because of the internet, but it's because of the particular monopolization of the culture. So these are global systems. I think this is true. This is fairly new that you have, Live Nation operating in dozens of countries all over the world. When we had first launched our streaming campaign, we were trying to also do this from the other side to say, we have workers all over the world who are also opposing this. So Spotify has offices, or did at the time, I'm not sure if more have closed since COVID, but had offices in every major city on earth, or had 40 or 50 offices or something. So we had a day of action internationally and had picket lines simultaneously at Spotify offices in 15 cities or something, which is an enormous organizing challenge, right? We haven't quite, I don't think, been able to keep up that level of internationalism to take on these companies. But you see glimpses of it, I think, right, in some of the BDS efforts, like the band's Boycott Barclays efforts. You had sort of like international cooperation to try to get Barclays Bank kicked out of the sponsor of music festivals all over the place. So, yeah, I think there's opportunities, but of course a lot more work we have to do organizing to cope with the scale of a monopolized culture industry that's also now internationally monopolized.
Well, Netflix is like that, too. It's the same thing as with Spotify. They go into markets, they find product, they put it on. They have offices all over the world. They translate things into every language. They dub stuff themselves. They do all this work locally. But the idea that it's new, it's not that new because, even in the 20s and 30s, the U.S. film industry was highly international. They were selling this stuff all over the world. And, famously, they wouldn't pull out of Germany, except for Warner Brothers, until very, very well kind of into, Hitler's, I'm not sure what the right word is, chancellorship. So the U.S. film industry has always done this, and it's not that new. So what's new is that they're able to reverse the process a little. Netflix does that a little. But the stuff that they pick is usually not very challenging. There was a brief period where they were picking things like Alice Rohrwacher films or, various kinds of films that are not just generic product. They're not doing that anymore. I think that it's still essentially an American issue and an American problem. The Chinese market is very over-exaggerated. I don't think it's as important as people think. It's starting to fail. Their domestic product hasn't really been able to compete with Hollywood, although they thought it would for a while. And, theater attendance is down in Asia. So it really still all comes from Hollywood. It's still very much based in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I was sort of going to say something similar at the end part there, which is Ross Douthat wrote this piece a while ago about why is cinema not sexy anymore? And, it's a problem, but one of his answers was China, which, that's a pretty big claim. But part of it is a thing that I think Hollywood likes to say a lot, which is that the prominence of the Chinese market really is exerting this influence, which sounds true. They're a major power, a lot of people, a lot of money. But the moment you Google one of the words, the whole thing kind of falls apart. There aren't that many American movies that are brought into China anyway, so the market isn't that big to begin with. And it always seemed like a bit of a dodge to me, especially on something like that, where you could tell yourself, perhaps it's China, and in China they don't like sexy things, or perhaps it's that a notoriously conservative company and Disney now owns a third of the box office every year, which seems a little closer to the point to me, is perhaps less interesting because it's homegrown. And so I think in a lot of it, it's what gets talked about sort of as globalization in film is actually still, we're actually talking about Hollywood. And even in the sense of what gets brought over, we codify pretty quickly what counts as a national cinema. When we all talk about French cinema, we're not talking about mainstream French cinema. We're talking about the movies America brings over because we're that's French. It's people being sad somewhere. Or the same thing sort of when Parasite was running around and everyone was just wow, look at this, art house film about class. And it's no, he's Spielberg in Korea. That's what we bring over from there. So yeah, I think the way it gets discussed is a bit of a misnomer because it is actually we're still talking about Hollywood, and the thing that people are reacting to is in fact still in Los Angeles. It's not a series of other places now exerting greater influence.
Great, thank you. We have time for a few questions from the audience. We'll collect 2 questions, if anyone. And Simone will pass the microphone. Go back over there in the blue hat.
Hello. First, thank you for all of your very wise words. Something I've been thinking about, I guess, because it's somewhat relevant to my work is, we've been talking a lot about Hollywood and specifically film and TV, but I guess something I've been thinking about is how digital media sort of exists in that ecosystem, like specifically like YouTube and even more specifically like streamers, like straight up Twitch streamers. And like, I feel like you always see so many recaps of like episodes of television shows on Hulu that like probably pale in comparison to the numbers that like a random Kai Cenat stream is doing. And so I guess I wonder what your thoughts are regarding how Hollywood would respond to that and how they're going to, and I guess like, where the future of people, where the future of these larger corporations vying for these people's attention is going to lie.
Maybe we'll collect the other question and we can answer them all. There are two over here. Maybe if you want to both share your
Can you
question?
keep your hands up?
Yeah, mine was sort of related because I was going to ask about TikTok related to similarly, like, again, it's like a platform owns it. So it's, like YouTube, it's a big thing. Also, it's Chinese, right? And, but like, it almost is like proof of that, like a lack of standardization is what's like capturing people's attention, like kind of being unhinged. But then also you have people like Trump, like trying to really, appeal to a certain formula. Do you want to add to this, Yabe?
Well, it's sort of connected, but it's more about Adorno. As you mentioned, as you referenced in the beginning, many of us have pushed back on Adorno over the years because we read him as a paranoid European snob who was afraid of jazz and called astrology fascism. And in an age of like impending fascism, I wonder what and regressed culture. What about the regressed viewer or audience? Like, and I think you mentioned it at the beginning. Like this audience, who are all of us who are we're listening to Taylor Swift, we're watching Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, and so on and so forth. We're on TikTok. We're watching exactly.
Sorry, who's this we?
It's the royal we.
That's the same we that the New York Times says.
Exactly.
This we.
No, but this is what I mean.
Recapitulating the Times.
But is there exactly the royal we? But I think my big struggle with Adorno is the agency of the viewer and the potential for a critical reading of this stuff that has surrounded us even more today. And I wonder where that possibility sits in today's media and culture landscape on TikTok.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think I can take all those in one, more or less. To the what's going to happen, they'll buy them out. This has sort of been the question at like every new moment of rivalry, including television. And television didn't break Hollywood; they just went into business together. And I sort of think something similarly when we think sort of like the standardization or not of TikTok. I think TikTok is extraordinarily standardized. Down to the point that like you start doing it, you can pretty quickly figure out how to put one of them together. Even down to that they all figured out that you need to start putting captions on all of them, not because they were like, we should be more inclusive, but because they assume your audio isn't on when you're looking at the video. So I think it's like actually quite standardized, and especially if they make them divest, somebody will probably buy them out. I think to the part though about like there being more viewers, I think that's just true. I mean, one of the things I have often said to my friends who are more or less in the milieu of people who are in this room is if there is some popular TV show, especially during the pandemic, that you and all your friends are talking about and you're tweeting about it and the magazines are writing about what it says about us today, nobody watches that show. Everybody who watches that show is involved in tweeting about that show. What people watch is Friends and How I Met Your Mother, and that's actually what America's up to. The rest of this is just like the people in this room hanging out.
I think that's true. And I don't believe any of these numbers. I don't believe any numbers that are not tested by some outside body. So, I don't care about view counts, any of that stuff. I don't believe in any of those things. I don't think any of it is true. I want to see someone prove that to me. Any of these companies can say anything they want. You don't know how they're doing these counts. We've probably all seen weird counts of our own posts, weird things happen. It's all just a fiction. It's complete fiction. And, as bad as television was in many ways before the so-called quality TV era, which was a complete branding exercise, at least Nielsen, which was a terrible, sloppy company, was not actually owned by the television networks. Just like box office reports are not controlled by the studios. This is why the streamers want to get rid of theatrical exhibition, so that they don't have to answer to anybody. And I'm sure a lot of people are on using Twitch and other things, but it's just a big mystery, essentially, right now.
Yeah, I would say that became like a big part of the union fights last year, was the streamers had spent so long telling Wall Street 200 million people in America watch whatever, it doesn't matter what it is, which, if that number is true, indicates a lot of money that would then be shared with the people who made it. But then when the people who made it came knocking, they're like, look, 12 people watched this show.
So they were like 200 people watched it for 2 minutes each.
Exactly. Yeah. I think along that line, it's just like part of it is just most of these numbers are made up.
Yeah, or like Facebook video was the big example. They're just straight up lying about their numbers. All these media sites, did the video pivot, and then it was just all fake. But yeah, the social media platforms are just as or more monopolized than all the other companies we've been talking about. I think they also really instill a mythology of naturalness, that these algorithms are something you're creating. It's just giving you back what you want, your own personal taste. Of course, Meta has people figuring this stuff out to keep you on the platform. The algorithms are designed to do this, to feed back a certain thing that I think ultimately creates the same kind of sameness that we're talking about. But just like the Spotify algorithm, the TikTok algorithm, all these algorithms are produced, owned by huge monopolies with an interest that is not ours. Does that mean there's not like cracks in it to where this stuff can be useful and that we are unfortunately just have to use because there's no other option because they're monopolies? Yes, of course we have to do that, and we can think about where those cracks exist and how to exploit them. But yeah, I don't think there's any naturalness to how those platforms operate any more so than the more traditional cultural industries.
Oh, I'm scared to end this. Did you say that everybody, Adorno was a European snob and who just feared did you just say he was feared death? Jazz. Actually, on the contrary, he used to go to the Apollo Club in Harlem, and that's a kind of misreading of his attitudes about jazz. But I know what you're talking about. He was certainly European. He certainly had some questionable judgments. I thought you had said that he feared death. And my students, I often say to my students in the last day of class, I say, you've been a fantastic class, but, with philosophy, we rarely give you any nice answers you want. But because I want you to applaud at the end of my class and love me, I have to be really upbeat and say something very optimistic. And then they don't know what to do. They don't know whether to clap or not. And so I'm sort of leaving them in an impossible position. But I wanted to say that one of the strangest things about the impact of the dialectic of enlightenment is that everybody disapproves of the examples chosen, except the Hollywood ones, the favouring of Schoenberg or some modern music and so on. And yet Adorno was taken up by every conceivable sort of radical group thereafter. He objected to students protesting and called the police, but only because he said that they would be so severely punished in a manner that Jews had been punished, and their choice was between protest, punishment, and pacification. It wasn't he had anything against the student protests, but just didn't think the time was right. It was very interesting, which is interesting for us to think about today. It was... he gives us a lot of things to think about, which I think is very good. And he was taken up by the feminists, despite what he said. He's even loved by jazz theorists, although they fetch about him constantly. You know, he says this and this, but they take the method. And so I think what we learned from that is that a lot of his insights were so deeply relevant. And it's just, we have to rethink the examples we choose, which was the first thing I said today. I think it really helps us to reconsider the kinds of targets we have and what we choose to think about. And I don't think it's only Hollywood, but that's one thing to think about.
Great, thank you all so much. Now there'll be a 15-minute break, and then we'll have a lecture by Sky Hopinka.